Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another installment of the Rocky Recap. This is for Saturday, April 9th, 2022. Rocky opens his show, usual little music, that sort of thing, and he jumps right into talking about how every morning is as it's designed to be. Maybe. Can we grasp the beauty that we've been granted to see and love and embrace? And no matter how you say it, I certainly hope we do have that ability. I think that's very important, to have a sense of gratitude for the world, as messed up as it may be. There's a certain joy in being able to be there to witness it. But perhaps that's a reaction or something we can only believe in because we might live in a fairly quiet corner of the world. Perhaps people feel differently in other places. But where we are, it's nice to cultivate a sense of gratitude. I think that's a good thing to do. But then he goes on to get a little bit more theological. He says, can you imagine some atoms 100 trillion years ago making all of these emotions, making all of this world? And I would say, yes, I can imagine that, as much as I can imagine an eternal being just willing all of this into existence. They're both equally amazing, and unlike Rocky, I've taken the time to actually understand both perspectives rather than just reject a position that isn't mine out of hand. I do try, after all, to keep an open mind. Someone has to. We humans, he says, are the only ones who attempt to alter what God put into motion. So maybe he's against civilization now. Perhaps he's against resource extraction. What are we really saying here? Because his words can be taken in a very environmentalist direction. Though more than likely, he is just meaning this in some sort of homophobic or transphobic way, neglecting to mention that deviations from the gender binary and deviation from what we know as heterosexuality are found throughout the animal kingdom. But, as usual, facts are not important on the Rocky show. More on that later. He goes on to say, if you've got parents and grandparents, you should call them and say that you love them. And sure, if you've got that kind of relationship, which most do, go for it. Rocky, sadly, apparently lost his mother when he was just 40 years old, and I'm sorry, that's too young to lose your mother. And apparently he also lost his father when he was very, very young as well. And at the risk of getting too nonpartisan and plainly wholesome, he starts yelling, Mom, 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 Dad, 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 Men, 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 Women, Women, Women. That's how I want to say it. And okay, you have the freedom to use those words as you want, and so do we. That's how freedom works. If you aren't affecting others' freedom, I've got no problem with you. Use whatever words and identify however you like, because again, I believe in freedom. He talks about struggling with decisions, and honestly, it's tough to figure out exactly what he's saying here, so I'm going to have to just leave it there. Rocky speaks without a script or notes, so it may be safe to conclude that he himself may or may not know what he's talking about either. But I freely admit that's pure speculation. He starts to talk about how politicians should be like soldiers and go into battle, and meanders into talking about D-Day and describing how the landing craft were makeshift. Well, the Higgins boats and other landing ships were purpose-built and mass-produced, but that's neither here nor there. That, I will concede, is one of Rocky's factual errors that is not materially relevant to his point. It just helps paint a picture of a man that is generally less informed than he wants you to believe. He brings up having a lot of kids, and this one's personal for me. Having a lot of kids is something that, thanks to his beloved capitalism, has become essentially impossible for all but the hyper-elite. Having a child is tantamount to a financial death sentence if you aren't already doing very, very well. I own a construction company, and on paper, I make a very comfortable living. But I still live paycheck to paycheck, and I drive a truck from the previous century and frequently have to rely on digging through dumpsters for food so that my daughters can have the best food we can give them. Ever wonder why so-called primitive people have big families and so-called modern people have few and sometimes no children? It's in large part because capitalism makes it very hard to support a large family. What was once an asset has become a profound liability. But you're right, Rocky. Having a big family is a blessing. But it's a blessing I will never have the opportunity to enjoy because people like you stand up for a system that robs us of everything. He's got to contrast his wholesome depiction of the family, of course, with the dark evil. So, of course, I come up. He says that I said that the Constitution is no good and we should do away with it, and proceeds to call me a fool and imagines that I instead think we should embrace Marxism. We've already covered this, but he's wildly misquoting me and again imagining me as a Marxist. But sure, I'm the fool here. He says it's caused more death than any other ideology out there. The only way you can believe this is if you don't consider capitalism as an ideology and don't look at its historic and current death count. I did an episode about this on my main podcast, Autonomia, which is a side project of, a while back, so I'll try to be fairly brief. But before I get into this, I'll mention that Behind the Bastards, which I try to plug every chance I get, I think it was called The Most Evil Company in History, something to that effect. It was one of his early episodes, and it's very, very detailed, and if you have the interest, please look into it, because it'll give you kind of an idea of what I mean when I start talking about capitalism. So anyway, the commonly cited figures for the number of deaths attributed to communism come from a book called The Black Book of Communism. It has been repeatedly debunked for using extremely shoddy methodology, including counting dead German soldiers invading the USSR and Chinese children never born as birth rates fell during urbanization as victims of communism. They use any way they can to pad out their numbers. This is, there's talk about the deaths of COVID being victims of communism. That's how this stuff works. They find any little kernel they possibly can to make it a bigger number. And of course, me saying this sort of thing to a person like Rocky would mean that I automatically have to be a communist rather than a person capable of critical thought and looking at ideologies that I may not even believe in with a critical and open-minded lens. Oh well. And that isn't to say these governments don't kill people, but their methodology doesn't hold up under serious analysis. But again, facts don't matter on the Rocky Radio Show. As a counterpoint, there are people who have tried to calculate the victims of capitalism. And while a true number is impossible to calculate because the majority of its victims are indigenous folks and people in the so-called third world, where record keeping is much less reliable. We can take one of the first capitalist institutions, however, as an example. The East India Company set up shop and turned a big chunk of India into a private militarized plantation. Shortly thereafter, 7 to 10 million people died of starvation. You might recognize that as a comparable number to the Holocaust. And, of course, the death didn't stop there. Capitalism is by far the most mass murderous system ever devised. It makes murder profitable, so naturally, murder will occur on an industrial scale. My episode on capitalism takes on the subject, again, in brief, because its crimes and abuses could fill thousands of books, and they do. It's a system of nightmares for the vast majority and of wealth machine for the very few on top. In the words of Martin Luther King, in 1952, he said, "Capitalism takes necessities from the masses and gives luxuries to the classes." That one's for you, Rocky. Chew on that. There have been attempts to calculate the annual death toll of capitalism, and I will say with full disclosure, it is somewhat difficult because the deaths caused by capitalism can be difficult to quantify. With that caveat, the deaths of capitalism are estimated to be around 14 million per year. So basically, that is every decade or so is more deaths than the most ambitious death totals of capitalism. Even if this number is flawed, that's something to think about. The studies described is by the Horizons newspaper, and it lays out their case and methodology as follows. Capitalism has ruled contemporary society since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism organizes the means of production to generate profit for the few rather than meeting the needs of the many. Capitalism has wreaked havoc on our planet and our worth as individuals. Capitalism will not satisfy the needs of the vast majority simply because it is not profitable to do so. Because the basic needs of many people worldwide are being ignored by capitalists, millions of people are left to die each year. For the sake of argument, let's assume that these totalitarian states were actually communist. Dividing 100 million deaths that took place over the 80 years is just into just 1 year results into 1.25 million deaths each year. Capitalism has killed 1,020% more people than communism has. Deaths due to capitalism each year fail to account work-related mortality, war casualties, suicides due to the pressure of the wage labor system, and many more deaths that go ignored. The truth is, tallying the death toll of capitalism to prove how socially horrendous this system is would be like counting all of the atoms in every star in the Milky Way galaxy. While it is theoretically possible to tally, it is totally unnecessary to develop an understanding of which the massive scale that we are dealing with. And so that's the end of the quote there. So you're allowed to be skeptical about these numbers. I have my own reservations as well. But it seems easy to conclude that capitalism is at least every bit as lethal as communism, and more than likely many, many times worse. Rocky says we being these people he calls Marxists, never go to the funeral of kids shot by gangs. Well, does he? Seriously, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, Rocky. When's the last time you went to a murdered kid's funeral? For me, I don't go to funerals all that much. I am still pretty young and don't encounter them that often in my life. And I tend to focus my work on those that are still alive and those that will be alive, with the little time that capitalism hasn't annihilated of mine. He says they, again, people he deems to be Marxists, don't want to have a discussion or to convince you of their ideas. Well, speak for yourself, Rocky. I've tried reaching out to you to quite a few times, and you've shown that you don't have the courage to stand having your ideas challenged. You're not interested in a dialogue, and I find that disappointing. And in large part, that's why this podcast is happening, because the last time and only time I called into your show, you changed the subject and started screaming about it rather than actually listening and having a real adult conversation. So unfortunately, it's going to have to just be a one-way thing until you decide you have the courage to explore ideas together. He talks about how GIs should have to go to fight and the politicians don't. And he proposes an idea that 10% of the politicians will have to go fight in any war. Sure, whatever, man. That would be cool, but no government will submit to that level of accountability. You're just talking into the void about what might be a fun idea, but it's not ever going to happen under this government. He says military personnel shouldn't be sent to fight if it's unrelated to your national well-being. And again, sure, but when politicians determine what is and is not in our national interest, I don't think there's much chance that this will actually do us any good. For some reason, he brings up people overthrowing the Shah of Iran as if it was a bad thing. And, the Shah, for the record, was installed by the American government and was widely seen as a brutal dictator. He replaced the democratically elected president of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, who leaned socialist, so naturally, the only way to protect the freedom of the people is to forcibly depose him and install a dictator who's more friendly to global capitalist interests. Maybe these can be added to the deaths under capitalism. Have a look at how many democratically elected governments have been overthrown by the American imperialists and replaced with dictators, and you might start to get an idea that you've been lied to. Anyway, The Shah was eventually overthrown by a multi-partisan group of people, and the faction that emerged on top were the fundamentalists led by Ayatollah Khomeini. So, I hope you didn't hear it first here, but maybe you have. You can trace a direct line from the Iran that you're terrified of today and America overthrowing a democratically elected government because for some reason we cared if a mountainous nation in the middle of nowhere decided they wanted to be socialist. That's the Cold War in a nutshell. We are still living with the aftershocks of this same dynamic all over the world. But yeah, let's pretend like the overthrow of the Shah was first a bad thing, and second, happened in a vacuum with no cause or context. Good analysis, Rocky. He reads an email from a caller of his talking about how they were so poor growing up and that their father converted a bus into a camper because they couldn't afford a hotel and having to work 2 jobs to support a family, and acts as if that's a good thing. It sounds like a nightmare. That's not the American dream. And as prices continue to soar and wages continue to fail to keep up, we are seeing never before seen levels of wealth disparity. Parts of the South are reaching literally third world levels of poverty, and even some areas are being labeled as human rights violations by the UN. But by all means, keep waving that flag while all that's beneath it starves, rots, and rusts. Good job. The American dream has become the American nightmare for an ever-growing chunk of the population. But remember, Rocky says don't nitpick. Generally, when someone bases their points on falsehoods and then is challenged and says don't nitpick, that's probably not a reliable person. He brings up the double standards of masks among the elite, and yeah, that sucks. But that's what the elite do. This isn't new. What really starts to get me upset here, though, is when he talks about refugees and how they have Nikes and iPhones, at least the ones coming from North Africa, and that these aren't real refugees escaping dire circumstances. These are people, again, that have Nikes and iPhones because, for some reason, it's in moments like this that Rocky shows just how deeply clueless he is on how things actually work and how he cannot be relied upon as a source of good information. People fleeing wars in Africa and the Middle East often had comfortable lives before they had to flee, and then their homes and neighborhoods were leveled, and then their cities were leveled. I wonder if Rocky feels the same way about Ukrainian refugees. They had modern lives before their homes were turned into powder too. Do you think maybe having a cell phone is going to be one of your most valued possessions as you flee your home and your community and need to contact loved ones and establish yourself in a new place? Do you think maybe a cell phone will be among your most valuable tools? A self-identified Christian having this sort of ignorant indifference is embarrassing, disgraceful, and extremely unchristian. But he will tell you not to nitpick or focus on the details. He then goes on to talk about how politicians are corrupt and brings up Hunter Biden and Hillary Clinton. And yeah, Rocky, American oligarchs are corrupt. They're oligarchs. That occurs on all sides. And if you still think we can keep putting good people into this system and it will somehow stop being corrupt, then again, you expose yourself as having no understanding of how politics works. That's not how this works. He then goes on to talk about how some jobs are becoming obsolete and pipelines are being shut down. And yeah, there's a lot to discuss there. And, I have a few different positions on this. Basically, jobs will become obsolete. No one mourns the loss of the knocker-up or the lamplighter. With that said, the pipeline and domestic, versus foreign sourcing are tough issues. We all know that we won't stop using oil tomorrow or even next year or more. So we should probably get the cheaper stuff and rather than fund countries that hate us or don't align with our values. Maybe. There's a discussion that can actually be had there, and I'm open to hearing sides from both perspectives. Like, we can have a real discussion there because you can weigh your priorities against each other and try to figure out the best outcome given our circumstances in the real world. I had to make a phone call, or I should say I had to take a phone call, during this part here, so I missed a bit of this segment, but when I tuned back in, there was a caller on talking about how Zelensky and Trump had some sort of a meeting together. He was basically alleging that Zelensky is corrupt, and probably. Government corruption, however, isn't super important right now, and again, governments are corrupt. That's how it works. At what point are we really trying to make here by bringing up the corruption of the Zelensky government? The caller then goes on to bring up the Great Replacement theory, and Rocky gives it a full endorsement and says it's definitely a plot and that we will fix it. The caller says that we don't have time to fix it, and if his worldview is accurate, then you might agree. Other people feel the same way about voting and climate change. Our society is approaching so many overlapping crises that time is not something it makes sense to feel like we have. Anyway, he then goes on to read, I think, Psalm 14 and put extra emphasis on the line, "No one does good." It's a little spooky. I like to think that I do good. I like to think that I'm doing good right now. And I like to think that I do good throughout my life, surrounded by other people that are also interested in doing good. So maybe you just have bad company. Who knows? Maybe hang out with more anarchists, see what happens. And the caller keeps talking over Rocky. And this is kind of funny because you can hear Rocky sighing audibly every time he tries to get a word in edgewise, and the caller just bulldozes him. With that said, this is an issue with 94.9, and I do this to Lee all the time accidentally. It's actually pretty hard to hear the host over the call-in lines, especially when it's little stuff like them trying to talk. It's just, you don't always hear it. And so the caller goes on to say that Obama is in control of this whole situation, but it's actually not Obama, apparently, and there's someone beyond that who's in a deeper state of control. Rocky, of course, emphatically agrees. This is par for the course for right-wing discourse. We all hear this all the time. Folks have their different opinions. It is what it is. It's not something that even makes a whole lot of sense to argue because it relies heavily on faith rather than direct evidence. So anyway, they get away from all of that and get away from, more importantly, what to do about this whole crisis. And the caller says that the answer is God. And Rocky, of course, agrees emphatically and says that God will empower the right person at the right time. A political messiah, I guess, though I thought that was supposed to be Trump, but maybe I lost count. The final segment, he goes straight to the phone calls, and Lee calls in. He says, "Great show as always." Lee, I do wonder if you were listening. I do wonder if you're listening now, actually, as well. But if you if you are, I wonder if you were listening to this show, because there were some nuggets in this one for sure. Anyway, Rocky agrees to come out to a food drive that Lee is hosting out in Old Saybrook for the price of coffee and donuts. Of course, realistically, he would have come regardless. Apparently, though, Rocky and I both take our coffee the same way, black. Rocky urges his listeners to come, and good for you, Rocky. That's a good thing. You really should encourage people to help each other out. Paul from Norwich calls in, talking about sending illegals to politicians' homes and using their resources, and sure, sounds like seizing the elite's assets to distribute them to the needy? Yeah, okay, sure. I say this, of course, with some sarcasm because that isn't quite what he's saying, but it's fun to kid. He tells us not to worry and says that we shouldn't be anxious and everything will be all right. Thanks, Rocky. That's easy for an elderly man to say who's lived through one of the most prosperous times in Western history and is on the edge of a massive decline. Easy for you to say. He says that he will endure names and insults slung at him for defending the cause of Christ. Big thing to say, but okay. He says calling him names shows what fools you are. Interesting closing words from a man who calls everyone who disagrees with him a communist, including people calling him out for calling everyone he doesn't agree with a communist. Yeah, kind of ironic there, Mr. Name Caller. Anyway, he tells people to go out to the food drive and tells folks to come to a movie with him tonight with a friend of his who shows screenings of various films that are within that political view. He then finishes off by saying, "Stand firm against the crooks, the liars, and the cheats." Yes, Rocky, I agree, and I most certainly will. Anyways, unlike my dear friend Rocky, I will return your emails. You can send any questions, comments, concerns, rants, or anything otherwise to rockyrecap@gmail.com. Just made the address, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Unlike Rocky, I'm not afraid of a little heat from people. I always encourage an open and passionate dialogue. I hope you have a great day, and thank you so much for your patience listening.
I eat meat and drive trucks and shoot